On this episode of Interconnects, I'm interviewing Arvind Narayanan. Arvind is a professor at Princeton University and co-author of the Substack and book AI Snake Oil. This is one of the few Substacks that I read regularly. It's a great kind of tap of resources on how AI is informing policy, how it is, what risks are real, what are not, kind of how to disentangle hype from AI. Arvind has a longer history in AI than just generative AI, kind of a big critic of predictive AI and policing, a history in privacy. This conversation, we cover a lot of recent things, why people should use AI to understand it, how to predict general AI versus the progress of generative AI, scaling laws, agents, scaling myths, some of the recent research on academic agents and reproducing science, the book, privacy, general commentary on being an academic, and other topics. Hey, Arvind, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nathan. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited to meet you. I think some people that are listening to these know that I'm now going around and inviting people that I've wanted to talk to for a while to come on. And this is the way that busy people can actually have a forcing function to talk. And your Substack is one of my favorites, which is, this is now repeating myself with the intro. And I'll kind of jump into it. You posted about this today when recording on Friday, October 4th. It was one of your facts, but for the frequently asked questions for the book. But it's like, how do you balance being labeled as an AI critic while also trying to balance the hype? While also, it's clear that you understand that this technology will have powerful change. And how do you approach that?
Yeah. Internally in my head, there's not that much of a contradiction at all, between these things. I'm, in general, profoundly optimistic about tech, and that includes most types of AI. One of the things we say in the book is that AI is an umbrella term, so some types of AI don't work well at all. But when it comes to foundation models, generative AI, etc., in the book, ultimately, in the long run, we're optimistic. And certainly, speaking for myself, I am a heavy user of generative AI myself. So even in the near term, I can see the positive impacts. In the long term, very much so. That said, I think if, as a society, we want to realize that positive vision, I think we need, a group of people who are getting ahead of the harms instead of waiting until they materialize on a large scale. And I think that that function is systematically undersupplied by the market. And the folks who do that are often, generating alarm more than evidence, and because that's kind of what the market for attention rewards. So I think there is room for someone to say, look, I'm doing computer science research to figure out, okay, these are the harms, and these are maybe overblown harms, etc. And I think that's really part of what it means to be optimistic
I really
as
like
a
this.
society.
It's really similar to what I say about AI too. It's part of why I joined AI too is because I want these researchers to be more vocal about it, because it feels like this is the time. We don't do a lot of harm focused research, so I think that's why the kind of the difference is the research you've been doing, which comes out in the blog, is really focused on different ways that AI can change society, and I think it's good. And I need to do more work on kind of understanding the methodology that people should be doing based on whether or not you are a technical researcher that wants good outcomes. Well, you're both technical researchers, but whether or not you're focusing on methods or you're focusing on applications is a
Right.
potential way to do it.
Right.
And I was just in DC this week, and we were talking about public AI, which is mostly to distinguish between private company AI. And you had mentioned this with your book, and it's the difference between language model work and getting out ahead of the harms of that versus all of AI is actually harder from a policy perspective than I was expecting. So I go to these events and I expect it to be look, language models are taking off now. We need to be we can get out ahead of this because there was already attention on AI. But I find it hard because there are existing harms of other types of AI, which you call predictive AI in the book, which we've heard about for years. And it's I don't know how to disentangle those for a mass audience, because I really think that that's why the smartest people are in the room, is because we have these big problems with foundation models that are changing things. But how do we guide policy to understand the differences?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, policy can be frustrating. I always like to say that tech policy is only frustrating 90% of the time. I very much understand the frustration. As domain experts, we might see things much more clearly than policymakers. But I will say that, in my experience, the politicians that we see on television might not be very well informed about tech or really any other subject, but they do have large staffs of experts and many people with PhDs even. And there's certainly always things that can be better, but I've, for the most part, despite the frustrations, been gratified by my interaction with policymakers and with the depth with which we're able to get into things in some of those more focused, more private conversations, as opposed to what you might see in the media.
Do you agree with kind of my presumption before the question, which is that we're somewhat earlier in this foundation model scaling phase with like when policy conversations are starting? Or were there conversations like this when AI, like recommendation systems, and then they didn't have tangible outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, we're always early. And there's that famous paradox. I'm blanking on the name here. Basically, it says if you intervene in the course of technology too early before the evidence for what the harms are is clear, then obviously it might have unintended negative consequences. But if you wait until the technology is entrenched, then it's too hard to get the industry to shift course. So yeah, I mean that's always a challenge. I think in a sense, certainly we're early with foundation models, but I think there are a lot of things we know already. There are many materialized harms from foundation models. For example, the generation of non-consensual nudes from text-to-image models, that's just affecting people on such a massive scale, and it's compared to the scale of the problem, it's not been getting enough attention.
It's
But on
like
the
I
other
don't want to
hand,
work on image generation for that reason. And I almost feel
right?
like Anthropic might be in the same boat. Like all the tech companies have the same product stack and they all release the
Yeah,
same things within a few months of each other, except for like
yeah,
Anthropic does fewer of the things than Google and OpenAI.
it's a philosophically speaking, it's a classic challenge from a utilitarian perspective. It feels like we don't want to be part of something that is so harmful, but then one person abstaining from it ultimately doesn't change the outcome because, in a sense, we're pretty replaceable. I don't know how to grapple with that. But just to complete that thought, from a policy perspective, there are many areas where we don't know enough right now, most notably when it comes to catastrophic harms. But I think we should be working to develop evidence, and I think that shouldn't be just left to researchers and civil society policymakers. Should be actively involved in incentivizing that process of gathering better evidence.
Yeah, I guess I've never asked you, I might have asked Sayesh this, but like what do you view open source foundation models, like the role playing in this kind of figuring all of this out? I mean, there was a popular paper last year, like on the marginal risks of open foundation models, which has informed a lot of policy. And generally, I think the summary of that was that like a, a lot of the risks are not being made worse, and then this like non-consensual deepfakes is definitely made worse by it. Are there any updates? Like, what are we, 6 months out, 12 months out?
Right. Yeah. So that was a really fun process to write that paper. I was part of this coalition of about 25 researchers from many different organizations. Were you on the paper? I forget.
No,
I apologize.
no, I wasn't.
It was a pretty big group. Yeah. So yeah, you had the summary right for what it looked like back then. But that said, it wasn't definitive by any stretch of the imagination. One of the contributions of the paper was, look, here's a risk assessment framework, and so we have to have counterfactual reasoning. So we have to think about how some of the existing ways of defending against certain threats, I mean, let's say disinformation, right? It's not a problem for the first time with AI. We really need to be thinking about how those defenses apply to AI generated threats, including, cybersecurity, various other things. So those are things we could be doing right now. But again, I think this type of research is really undersupplied by the market. There are people
Yeah,
doing
and
it, but there needs to be much
I
more.
was like going to get ahead of it, and I think like O1 type systems could be different, like things that are hard to fit into those, or like we don't really know exactly how it'll. Like it was easier to see where those trends were going until things like O1 happen. I think like a text to video model is fairly more predictable in my mind.
Possibly, yeah. I haven't thought too much about the safety implications of O1, but here's one clear gap in safety testing, right? Even though there are so many people who are doing, model safety evaluation, certainly they're doing useful things. However, really the concern when it comes to, open models and bad actors using them for, I don't know, hacking cyber infrastructure or whatever it is that it's not that these models are going to be kind of autonomous agents themselves, at least as of today. They're far from capable of really doing that, but that they're going to be part of compound AI systems that attackers are going to build in order to be able to carry out bad activities, right? And so if we want a proper safety evaluation, if we want to understand attackers' capabilities, unfortunately, we don't really have any option but to build those offensive systems for testing purposes. And that's obviously ethically fraught, probably illegally fraught. Companies aren't going to do it because it's just unnecessary bad PR for them. And, not too many people in civil society are doing it either. But if you look at the cybersecurity community, that has been the practice for, 30 plus years, and we need more of
Yeah,
that.
it's like I would expect some of the cyber researchers and or think tanks to be doing this. So
Yeah. Yeah.
Nicholas Carlini type of work.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Which, I mean, it can't all fall on one person is the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like that's the type of thing that I think it would be good for governments to fund.
I
Because
think
the
so.
governments cannot, the impression is that they can mobilize a few $billions for foundation model policy, compute, data, whatever, like academic support. And it's like you can't, we're not gonna, they're not gonna train their own model. They definitely can't train, you can't have like a government model for data privacy concerns anyways. So it's like they need to disperse it into these really tactical ways,
Hmm.
is what I think.
Although there has been talk of a government model. The Department of Energy has been advocating for some massive funding for building
The
foundation
DOE
models for
is
science.
building
Yeah,
models. So
yeah.
there's the like Aurora supercomputer, and they're trying to
Mm-hmm,
build. They're currently
hmm.
training about 8 billion parameter models with a mix of the like data from our previous AI2 models. So it's DOLMA plus other things, and then plus academic literature. And they're
Interesting.
training 8 billion parameter models, and they want to increase their allocation on their own supercomputers. There's like they have to go through the same allocation process to go up to 1 trillion parameters. So they want
Wow.
to do this. In an ideal world, it just succeeds. But I'm somewhat of a cynic, seeing how hard it is to train these models. That I'm like, I don't know how. Like, I would rather it be the AI2 and them, and we figure out how to merge our efforts. Because
Hmm.
if we have the same broad goals, the duplication is long term hard.
Yeah.
So
Is this part of the public AI advocacy that you've been part of, or?
the Argon, like the Aurora GPT, or what do you mean?
Well, thinking about public-private partnerships, is that part of the plan vision here?
I'm trying to come up with a vision for like how open source, like how having actual foundation models that are trained end to end in ways that are fully reproducible and documented, like how that impacts policy. And I think it's almost entirely in regulation and making sure that early regulation is informed by actual systems that we can look at in an extremely deep manner. And that includes bringing in social scientists and other people that are not AI native to be able to use these models in ways that APIs don't allow, and then education. So I think like NAIR's mission, the National AI Research Resource, is very much on the education side, which AI2 is a part of. AI2 is a big fan of this. Obvious asterisk that it needs to be funded by Congress, which is hard. But there's kind of other side of things, which is like how the regulatory sphere can have researchers who are established and not necessarily an education system working on these models. And I
Yeah.
don't know the level of financial investment that can get behind, but that's like what I
Hmm.
want to see. Like that's what I'm trying to flesh out in policy conversations, and like who are the people that would access this, and how it is. Like AI2 is a research org. We're better at doing research than getting the word out, and that's a work in progress. But it's like how to and like how to make it so Meta doesn't just become that, because Meta doesn't actually want, they might insert themselves, but they don't have the actual incentives that they want the government poking around in their models, probably.
Right. Right. Fair enough.
So that's a work in progress. I think we kind of see. I don't think I even intended to go this deep in policy, but it seems needed, and that's why I work somewhere where I can talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Glad you're doing that.
Kind of taking a step back, you had this tweet where you had said that a paradoxical thing about being on the AI snake oil beat is that I'm one of the heaviest generative AI users that I know. I'm very pro telling people they should use more generative AI. It's like I'm the person starting the conversation to get people free subscriptions internally because like our students our students don't have ChatGPT Plus, so they can't be like
Wow. Yeah.
right. I literally am like, here's some data, make me a plot, and I put it in my slides for a talk, and it's like that would take so long. But what are your favorite use cases? There's obviously notebook LLM is popular, which I think will fade. I think there's stuff to it, but there are like, what do you use it for?
Sure. Yeah, and I'd love to compare notes. So let me tell you some of my broad categories, I guess, and within each category there are many use cases. The obvious one, of course, is coding, and within coding, there's getting starter code for doing a thing, or debugging, or helping figure out a library, or the right
Sayash told me that you're
command.
like in the weeds as a professor looking at code, which I'm like, this is the modern type, like the modern research approach, and I love it.
Yeah, no, you have to. And, it's so easy, I think, as a professor to just become a manager. And that's terrifying because, like, it could be 20 years and you have a bunch of papers and you've graduated some great students, but then you can't do anything yourself. And yeah, I don't want to
AI
end
makes
up
it a
like
lot
that.
easier.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And like you said, data analysis, data visualization, that's a big one. But one use of coding that I'm enjoying a lot is building single use apps. So, like, I might want to do some data cleaning, right? So I can just create a one-time script for that and I do my data cleaning and then I'm done. I'm never going to use that
What are
app again.
what stack is this? Like, I've used Gradio, which I find it to be only okay for doing spaces, but do you have like a like a mini self-hosting that it's better at?
No, I mean, a lot of my stuff is things like I was saying, data cleaning. I'm not putting out production applications for
Yeah.
people to
I
use. So
wasn't
that would
sure if
make
you're making interfaces. Well, interfaces are nice for making things just a
yeah.
little bit more comfortable, which is why I
But
asked.
here's another example of single use apps that I think is it surprised me as someone who's been using this for a while. There was this really nice use case that I stumbled upon. This was actually with my kid. She's she's 5 years old. I was teaching her to tell time, and at first I drew a bunch of clocks on a piece of paper with random times and walked her through them. And she was getting it, but it was kind of getting boring for me to keep drawing these faces. So I pulled out Claude and I asked it to create a random clock face generator. And I gave it my specifications so that it was just at the right level of complexity for her. And then we played with it for like 10 minutes, and she really got it. And I haven't used that app since then. And this kind of
It's
thing,
the creative things.
yeah,
I agree.
yeah, yeah,
It's like the ability to not be daunted by something that seems ridiculous. Two things. One thing is that the clock reading is funny because most AIs are bad at reading clocks. So with the new AI2 vision model, like one of the lead scientists on the data side just got so frustrated that the model couldn't read clocks, so he just
uh-huh,
started paying people to
uh-huh,
annotate clock data, and that's
uh-huh.
the only reason why it can actually read clocks. But they
That's
can't
really
read
funny.
gauges. So like dial gauges are still, even if you solve clocks, you can't necessarily read dial gauges.
That's really interesting for two reasons. So one, in my application, I didn't need AI to read clocks, right? Just generate clocks, and that turned out to be a lot easier problem. And often we have this kind of generator discriminator gap, and usually the discriminator is easier. So here's a case where I guess the generation is easier. So you could easily, I think, use this to generate synthetic data of clock faces, and
Yeah,
then
everyone's going to
use
be able
that.
to solve it now that AI2's like we just released the data. They're just going to train on it as
Oh,
well.
nice, nice.
But
Okay.
well, it's not out yet, but it'll be out in a couple of weeks.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, this makes sense. I think that is like with Claude, I've found like I'm writing a mini textbook on RLHF, and it uses like
Right.
Pandoc to convert Markdown to PDF and ebook, and GitHub Actions to push it to a website. And I was like, this would be weeks of work to set up. Whereas now I just like found a GitHub repo and I paste the entire file in, and I'm like, it's not doing X, and it
Yeah.
does it, and I don't have to have
Yeah.
any understanding of the abstraction. And I've had
Yeah,
this
that's great.
experience with multiple times with Claude, with just passing in like hundreds of lines of code
Yeah.
where I know there's a bug and I can
Yeah,
describe the behavior and it just does it. And I'm like, this would be a day in grad school. So like
for sure.
that
Yeah.
is it's each one of those is single use worth like $20+ to me. If you're
Right.
looking at like if you're including the amount that I'm paid as an employer and things, but I would pay it just because I understand how that stuff pays off. But like most people don't. But like
That's
it's
right.
and then this relates is like I don't know how O1 will work yet. I think once you can upload files, the things like I'm using Claude for long context file editing will actually be better with O1 because it has a little bit of time to check its work, but it doesn't have some of these things that make it really easy to use Claude, like artifacts and files and stuff.
I haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but didn't OpenAI just release their artifacts competitor called Canvas?
Yeah, I'm guessing that might be enabled with O1, which would probably solve it.
Uh-huh.
And that'll be something that if O1 like models are to succeed, that kind of has to be the case. I'm not sure if O1 is enabled in Canvas because they also released a new GPT-4o-Canvas model that essentially means that they have like different chat tokens to handle different templates that the Canvas metadata gives them, I think.
Right. Makes sense.
On the topic of using AI, do you ever do any training? I was wondering like what the level of, because you do a lot of analysis on harms. Does that involve actually training models in your group?
Well, I mean, we do a lot of technical work. We're all doing technical work on a daily basis, right? But most of our research is on evals, and so we're not necessarily building models. Yeah, so we are doing a lot of evaluation, and a lot of what we do involves fine-tuning models. But while my grad students made sure they know how to build transformer models from scratch, it just doesn't come up in our research because that's not,
Yeah, that's what
the
I was
cap in the
just
research.
wondering if like, do you think it would be easy? Is it just not? It's like there's so many things to do, and it becomes not worth the time. Whereas I'm wondering if there are specific things, like if it can change the lens on how you view applications and stuff, if you do the training that leads to it, which is what these
Yeah,
labs
I
are
mean,
doing.
right. I mean, look, if we started a research project and we concluded that that's the best way to understand harms or whatever it is, then that's what we would do.
Yeah,
It's just
I'm
not come
guessing
up.
you do a lot of prompting things because
Yeah,
prompting and
yeah, of course.
evaluation
Yeah,
go very hand in hand.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, this makes sense. Kind of jumping ahead, one of the recent things you had was this core bench, which is like a
Mhm.
benchmark for AI scientists. How did you get interested in doing this? I think I've been very hesitant to go into agents. You have had more work on agents. I just find it hard to be scientifically grounded. So I'm seeing AI scientist plus agent evaluation. So it's kind of like the things that we need to get started. Is that kind of how you like? How did you realize you needed to do this?
Well, I mean, our whole effort with agents has been to try to make things more grounded, right? So, like the thrust of our research output on agents has been saying, look, the evaluation is not very rigorous. People are fooling themselves, and one of the high level messages we have as a result of that is kind of this capability reliability gap. Agents are capable of a lot of things, but they're so stochastic, so non-deterministic, and so unreliable that you can't really use them right now, whether in consumer or enterprise use cases. And I think Core Bench is continuing that to a certain extent. So we look at this AI scientist work, and we understand the aspiration, but we just don't think the technology is anywhere near that yet. And we haven't tried to evaluate those projects ourselves, but from what we're seeing of other people evaluating those, it seems like way overhyped. So we want to see, are there tasks in the research pipeline that are automatable today that we can evaluate in a rigorous way with benchmarks, and which, if automated, would actually save researchers a lot of time. It's great that other people are trying to automate the entire research process in one
I'm
go, but
so
we want to start
skeptical of it.
smaller. Yeah,
I think just like doing the automated thing is going to lead to more of the papers that we already don't like, which is like the slightly
yeah.
incremental things. So I don't really
Right.
see the automating of like generating new things in the short term being that useful. I mean, like there's people that say like there's going to be a whole
Yeah.
background economy of agents, and if that stuff is
Yeah.
true, like they're going to be doing research.
Yeah.
But uh,
So, I mean, to be clear, Core Bench is not about automating the
yeah,
generation of new things. So it's about the core stands for computational reproducibility, and this is something I think is missing in the scientific literature, including in machine learning. Ideally, we want every paper to be, point and click reproducible so that others can start building on it. But in practice, so many things go wrong. It could be that you're using a slightly different library version, and so some of the parameters are initialized differently, so your model produces a different output or whatever, right? So not just in AI research, in every branch of research, this is a big pain. So that's the part we're trying to automate with this benchmark.
yeah. I'm curious to see how this goes. I don't have a ton more thoughts on agents. The next thing on agents is really like how do you um, give more like leeway to discussions around artificial general intelligence. I'll posit that I think all the definitions are mostly smoke and mirrors, but like how agents change the trajectory of progress, because I have huge error bars. I'm like, I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't think it's like AI researchers poof out of smoke because we put a for loop around things, but I do think it'll be substantially different experience of to what we to ChatGPT interfaces that we have.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, totally agree with high error bars. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Am I interrupting you?
No, I'm just wondering how you view agents in these like AGI myths, religion things,
Yeah.
because they're very obsessed with agents and they
Yeah.
use terms like unhobbling of language models and things.
Hmm.
And I try to give them the benefit of the doubt because most of these people are in the labs and I'm not.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm like, this makes no sense. And I'll get to the scaling laws thing because I've read your piece and I've written up a piece on scaling that I haven't published yet. So this like
Oh,
agent
cool.
thing is leading into that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, so as a preliminary note, I mean, for in some cases we should give deference to what people in AI labs think and who are in the weeds of the stuff, but in other ways, I think they might be more likely to drink the Kool-Aid when they're in an environment where they're, it's self-reinforcing, it's a bit of a bubble, and it's also very much in their um, interest to believe those things, given how much money is riding on this. So yeah, I think we
Yeah,
should
like they need to
just
raise the money to reach
yeah,
their revenue targets to reinforce their existing multiples. So like they need to do
that's
these
right.
ridiculous Kool-Aid things, and
I think
that's
so.
a separate discussion.
Yeah. So a couple of things I will say I think about AGI with moderately high confidence. Uh, One is that the notion that it has to be one general system that does everything out of the box, I think, is a total red herring. The part of AGI that I'm interested in is the economic impacts. Is it going to be able to automate, a wide swath of the kinds of activities that are economically valuable today? And from that perspective, generality is mostly irrelevant. And we found this in a very small way ourselves while working on Core Bench. We were developing a baseline agent for this computational reproducibility task. And what we found is that while AutoGPT, which is a generalist agent out of the box, is not very good, with just like a couple of person, excuse me, with a couple of person days of effort, we were able to train the agent, if you will. I'm putting training in air quotes because it's not machine learning, but just putting guardrails around the mistakes and prompt engineering and adding a verifier, that sort of thing, to more than double its performance, right? Whereas to build an agent from scratch would have taken very long. So my point here is that I think this is more likely the way we will get to something that looks like AGI, which is that we'll start with some general frameworks, but then we will train it for many of the specific tasks that we want to do. And a
It's
couple of
like
programmer days of training effort is nothing when we're talking about automating a whole kind
yeah.
of line of work.
And like even ChatGPT has this. There's so many models in ChatGPT at this point. Like ChatGPT is a really nuanced system of how it passes information and handles things and stuff like this. So it like already
Yeah.
has some of this.
Yeah.
What is the main like tool that AutoGPT uses to orchestrate? Like what is AutoGPT actually doing?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay,
This is
that's
one
fine.
part of the code where I haven't been in the weeds myself.
It's fine. I'm just wondering because so Tim Detmers at AI2 has been really interested in Sweetbench, and he has
Uh-huh.
found similar things where he's like, people are overcomplicating this by
Uh-huh.
throwing crazy things at Sweetbench, where in reality, if you just like fine tune a model and do a lot of inference in the specific domain of like taking in GitHub issues, it does like pretty good. So like that's his
Interesting.
goal for like his year AI2 is do well in Sweetbench with really small specialized models. And like that's a different example of what you're saying where like agents are doing really specific things and you have to
Mm-hmm.
guide them.
Mm-hmm.
I largely agree. And it's like we're also going to see the economics for all of these things be shifting so dramatically in coming times. So it's like it's hard to predict. I don't know. That's why it's like I'm waiting for somebody to come along and be like, I have a really clear understanding of what they mean by agents, but I
Yeah.
guess the longer it goes on with nobody knowing is like
Yeah, I mean, well, there's kind of one sort of null definition of agents, if you will, a definition by exclusion, where you don't have to get very fancy at all, which is that unless you're using, the model itself to figure out how to accomplish the task, as long as you're putting any sort of scaffolding around the model. I think we need a different name for it. You can just call it a compound AI system, but I think people are calling it agents, so we're just going with that term. We're not trying to make the concept too fancy.
Yeah, that's funny. It's like we had arrived on composite AI systems in our
Yeah, yeah,
2025 planning, and I
sure.
that's I think the role of academia here is to like find benchmarks, bench, core bench, and make it clear that these are not like models out of the box, and they're just like you have to do entirely new types of engineering. So the things that people are going to solve and build to do this, whether it's small other models that read outputs and stuff, like that is entirely new research, but it is not just like a while loop and they do everything.
Yeah.
Okay, continuing on to scaling, I can kind of give you I have a hypothesis or something that I find interesting, and there's many directions to take this. So I think the two like canonical blog post references right now are like Dwarkesh's post and
Yep.
then your post. And Dwarkesh's post ends with like this. He says like 70% chance scaling works when we have AGI, and 30% chance that everything is screwed. And I was like, I agree with the numbers, but the adjectives and the outcomes attached to working and not really bothers me. And I've been trying to understand like what is changing in the language models when you scale and how analogies to like performance being better could work. I've been frustrated with AI safety people that are like log scales and compute read to like exponentials and evals. Some people are just not careful of talking about it in the AGI world, which makes it a lot worse. And then it's just trying to think about like what is actually changing. So what's changing is these really small probabilities in the model
Hmm.
where it's like we're predicting tokens on end, and you're making really small deltas. And then it's like, and what really it feels like is a small change in nuance where the big models tend to say more interesting things. And it's like, even if they have apples to apples eval scores, the big model you can tell is different. And like, why is
Hmm.
that? And where is that going?
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
was kind of listening to Dylan Patel talk about semiconductor fab. And if this like 1,000-step process where they have to have certain nines of reliability. And then it's like the difference between 3 nines and 4 nines over 1,000 steps is like a 40% yield or a 90% yield. And I'm
Hmm.
almost like, what if this scaling is just making it do harder tasks because at each time we just have slightly more reliability? And it's like we are generating 1,000 tokens and
Hmm.
stuff like this. So I almost like I can buy that as a method for what computationally is changing, but it doesn't really make it so any value is guaranteed. It's just like we're going to have more robust text generators, and then we still have to do all the work to build applications, to build the scaffolding for agents, to build the infrastructure and make that cheaper. So I'm like, okay, I think scaling mathematically is going to work because it is a mathematical relationship. But all of the other stuff is largely the burden that's on the labs to show us how to use it. So that's my theory.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I feel like there's some fundamental category error here. It's not that scaling will, stop making models better, but it's a limited sense of better, which is just doesn't readily translate to having these models do useful things in the real world. And we saw this already with the overexcitement over GPT-4, passing the medical licensing exam and the bar exam and that sort of thing. And then those professionals try to use these models. And it turns out, yeah, even if they're capable in some narrow sense, all of the hard problems are around how do you integrate this into people's workflows. And, we're just so far away from the models being able to take over those entire workflows. And it's just not fundamentally something you can learn through just pre-training on internet data. These are types of knowledge that are more similar to riding a bike than descriptions in a book. They exist in the minds of people, in organizations, in the relationships between people, and I think those are there's a large set of skills that can only be learned when AI is actually deployed in those organizations and learning from mistakes. And so that to me is the big
How do we
category error here.
prioritize that? So in one ways, the infrastructure build out will make that easier because all the AI stuff will be cheaper because there's more hardware. But like it feels like it's almost a social problem to manifest this belief.
Yeah, I mean, it is a social problem, and I think it has been a social problem. One way I think about this is that diffusion actually puts a speed limit on innovation. I don't think innovation can happen in a vacuum. I think scaling can happen in a relative vacuum, but that's only going to get you so far. And then if you want to actually make these models useful, it can only happen through a very gradual cycle where you deploy it, with 100 users, gain experience, and then you improve it to the point where 1,000 users can use it, so forth and so forth. And that's exactly what's happened with self-driving cars. And I'm like 90% confident at least that that's going to happen in many other domains.
Do you think that self-driving cars is a good analogy? Because people pose this to me, and I don't think it's quite right, because digital does make things easier. Like self-driving car, all the weird robotic humanoid things that are happening, that will be like self-driving cars. But I think that is like it can be much faster and more off-putting to people's day-to-day life than self-driving cars. Like, do you agree?
I think maybe we disagree on what percentage of a lot of different professions can be considered purely digital, like medicine or law or that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's like the tech ecosystem is going to be accelerated, but what
That's
does
right.
that
That's right.
actually? But like, what does that actually mean? Is like that's kind
Yeah.
of your question for me. Is like Google, Meta, iPhones all becoming more efficient is not actually probably going to change that much on their revenue numbers or anything.
Yeah, I don't know. And one way to think about this is, uh, if you have recursive self-improvement, have you like automatically achieved AGI? And a few years ago, I used to think that's obvious, and I think that's how a lot of people think. But now I think there's actually a very big gap between recursive self-improvement and AGI, and it'll be relatively easy to get to recursive self-improvement compared to the delta between that and AGI.
Yeah, I agree. Because I'm close, being mostly in the like fine tuning post training research. I follow the chatbot arena scores closely. I guess not that closely because I think that they need big, like they have big error bars on them. But there's been this trend where the models were getting better at like a slow rate, and then in the last 6 months, what the labs have said is due to like better post training. They've like been step changes on every time, and I'm like, this doesn't translate to any of this. Like it's not a takeoff scenario, but it's
Uh-huh.
like what there's very weird dynamics in the pace of improvement right there, and that's not even through scaling, so I don't really know what to make of that. But that's it's such an insular ecosystem in that regards.
Yeah.
Are there any applications that you see people outside of tech using AI in particularly good ways? I guess that's the early signal that things are changing, other than
That's
kids
right.
doing homework.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. I mean, entertainment is a big one, right? I have been surprised by the speed with which AI generated music, for instance, has become pretty normalized.
Yeah, and I don't know the proportion. Like a way to think about this is like what are the proportion of GDPs? And like tech is so dominant that it takes such a big change to a either tech or non-tech economy to really make these accelerations in productivity measurable. Yeah, I don't know. I think we're just very similar in some of these things. Um, I kind of have sometimes I start with history, but this will kind of zoom out the conversation. I think there's kind of the question of you started this book a long time ago. You have done other waves of working in technology with privacy and AI. It's like how does either perspective from the book or like 8 years or 10 years ago, like how does that change how you view today? So you have a lot of people like me that are like, this is the time to like establish my career. Like I did grad school, it's not serious, but now I'm like a professional.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's lessons to be had there?
From my experiences working on all of these areas,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'll say that when I look back at what has worked in my career and what hasn't, I think one thing that um, I can't give myself any credit for this, but it's worked out in retrospect, is being kind of opinionated and having kind of a thesis on where things are going in the long run, like a 5 to 10 year time frame, and what is going to be lacking and kind of undersupplied by the market was how I was putting it earlier. And so my thesis, for instance, way back 15 years ago, was that the tech industry already had too little accountability, and that gap was going to widen. And so that can't all come from, lawyers and regulators and humanists. There have to be actual technologists involved in bringing accountability to the tech
What
industry.
was your background before being a professor? Like, do you like a CS PhD?
Yeah, I did a CS PhD, and then during my postdoc, I was doing a startup on the side. I had fun, but ultimately, I realized that Silicon Valley culture was not for me. While I liked tech, I liked being on the side of, bringing accountability as opposed to full speed ahead.
Yeah, we could talk about this much longer, like over a drink, because that's like this moving from the Bay Area to Seattle is like I knew that I am unplugging from some of the like frenetic energy of the Bay Area,
Yeah,
which is like you want to be able to turn this on and off if you are trying to think clearly about the bigger picture of things. And like going
I
to
agree.
DC is good for this because going to
Hmm.
putting almost any of these AI founders into a room in DC would be like they feel like they're in a room of aliens, I feel like.
Yeah.
And that is it's almost like a filter by which a lot of their ideas are going to be tested through to become real. So there's a lot of value in it. Yeah, and then it's like
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Go
you
ahead.
can go on. I was just going to prod you about privacy because that's what your previous work is, and then on language models, how all of this, because this is like web scale data and privacy almost feels like the culmination of sayings like assume your email is public because eventually it is, and it's just like too much information to fathom.
So that was my perspective in graduate school. I mean that this whole privacy thing was temporary, and eventually we're just gonna all have to get used to everything being public. And the reason I started doing privacy research was this accountability thing. I thought companies were making these promises of privacy that, when you look at their practices, were not accurate, and I kind of wanted to do the research to show that they're not being fully truthful. And then once I started hanging out with philosophers and legal scholars and sociologists, my views changed quite dramatically. I think empirically, when we look at the last 15 years, the kinds of ideas that I had about, that we will increasingly lose privacy, that has not happened like at all. And,
How do you measure that? Like, how do you
yeah, sure.
measure we haven't lost privacy?
Yeah, so there are kind of concrete measures and there are also broader measures. You can just look at social media privacy settings, and back in 2009, actually a lot of it was defaulting to public, and today people are much more sensitive about making that private. So that's one.
Are they
Um,
not
the,
hurt by the data that was already out there?
uh, no, but I mean to some extent, but privacy is not about the monetary value of the data so much as it is about certain social norms and the way we want to relate to each other. So that's the other thing I got from philosophers and others. That's kind of the fundamental thing we want to preserve, right? Not some computer science sense of access control.
Yeah, so it's almost that
The,
like social media. So like the assumption that you had, which is something that I would have agreed with, especially a few years ago, still is that like social media is getting bigger and bigger, and those commercial incentives are to make everything public and accessible, and for various ad reasons. But like now we see that group chats are becoming more popular, and
exactly,
social
exactly.
media is becoming silos, and like I don't know how that would be predicted, but it's an interesting lesson. And then like how does that carry into what is happening with AI? I think like fair use of copyright aside, but like how is that going to change how people use models and how big tech is like serving models? Like Apple's models are very different in character than Google's, but I do think that they're all going to have pretty high standards on training on private information, because that's like nightmare fuel for these companies as they start outputting somebody's social security number with the name or something.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think some of those privacy violations will be more subtle than just having the social security number in the training data or even at inference time. I think so far it hasn't been that much of a problem because for the most part the products are just the models that have been pre-trained on web data, and so there the privacy issues are relatively minimal. But once you want them to start doing useful things, to be really embedded in different applications, if you want a good email assistant, it has to be trained or at least fine-tuned on emails. So then privacy becomes a big issue. And I think the most important thing is at inference time, if you want these agents, I'm sorry to use that buzzword again, but if you want these things to be able to orchestrate things for the user by coordinating between different apps, for instance, you have to break one of the foundational principles of cybersecurity, which is to isolate each app from each other, right? And so it's not just the privacy issue of the AI companies themselves having access to the data, but it's also that you're breaking down these internal barriers within our devices that exist for a very good reason to make it hard to hack into these devices. And so that makes us more vulnerable, not just to AI hacks like prompt injection, but also more traditional cybersecurity hacks.
Yeah. Have you thought about secure enclaves for training at all, where you can train models on data that you don't own by like pulling it in a secure manner to the model without ever holding the model?
So yeah, I mean, I think I know that companies are doing that a little bit, and then Apple does this, I think, for inference as
They
well,
do
or
this
at least
they had their whole fancy
yeah,
stack for inference,
yeah,
which is wonderful. Like how that
right.
is great.
But all of that only affects the issue of privacy of the data going into the model, right? So there's this whole other issue of having to violate, the isolation between different applications on a system, and that is something I don't know what to do about.
Yeah, so this is like how Apple is. I mean, Apple's been increasingly locked down in their apps with this regard. It's like it's good for the users, but it almost feels like it stifles innovation.
That's true. Yeah, there is a trade-off for sure. Yes, agreed.
And it's like, to what extent are trade-offs going to be revisited because of AI? I recently
Yeah.
have been hearing that like climate trade-offs might be revisited due to AI, which is like deregulation primarily because big companies want to use more green energy than they can hook up to their data centers, which comes with some other downsides, which is that other non-clean energy will probably increase a little bit while you're having a 10x increase in green energy or something like this. So
Mhm.
the word trade-offs is good. I think we're still early to try to predict them, but those are like the right things to try to signpost on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, okay, I'm gonna kind of transition into your book. I started it. I haven't finished it. One of the anecdotes was that Sayash asked when you're flying, what happens if big tech sues you for your research? Have you been sued?
No, fortunately, I have not. I have received legal threats, and actually, those were learning moments for me. So I think when we do this tech accountability type research, companies it's in a way it's hard for companies to sue researchers because it's pretty bad PR. And so there's a couple of reasons they might want to do it. One is they just really don't want researchers doing a certain type of activity, so they want to set a precedent, right? So it's not about this researcher, it's about future researchers. And the other is that the research that someone put out is really damaging to a particular company, and they like want to have it taken down, right? And that I realized happens much more often with smaller companies. So it's often startups that would often send us those threats because what we were saying was pretty threatening to them. And I was confident of our research findings, but it also got me to realize that some of the criticism that we often do in our research and writing like really matters to people, to their livelihoods. And I think that has um, gotten me to try to be much more careful. There are things even in the book that 2 years after the first drafts, I would have worded very differently and more carefully. So that's been kind of a learning experience for me. But when Sayash asked me that question, I was kind of a nobody, right? And so I could relatively freely do this kind of thing. But now that our work is well known and the book has had the attention that it's had, I think going forward, we need to do some soul searching and try to see how to
this
do this in a responsible way instead of kind of
this leads
being
into
seen as
another
attacking
problem for
people.
me is like I don't like that having distribution changes how you approach research as a
Yeah.
scientist, and it's like
Yeah.
I think that most scientists are kind of not necessarily negligent, but underappreciate how much distribution you can have on the internet if you play the game. And you obviously do extremely well. I'm doing well, having done this for a couple of years seriously. But I don't think like if you continue this and everyone's always thinking about the impacts of their work and distribution, it fundamentally changes how things like what the scope of things that can be done. And in that case, I don't like that it makes you second guess work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's totally true. And if what we were doing was purely science, then I think that would be really bad. But it's not purely science, right? it's 80% science, 20% advocacy, something like that. So I think it makes sense that those considerations matter to a certain degree. But I think with science, this distorting effect, comes about because of social media more than anything else. And I think that is a really big issue.
Do you have any solutions or advice to people?
um, well, I mean, I think the reason there is such a vacuum of attention that self-interested scientists can fill is because 95% of scientists pay no attention to distribution. I don't think that's optimal. I think a lot of people have this idea that their research is going to speak for itself, so they'll just put it out there and sit back, and people are going to subscribe to the journals. I mean, we kind of all know that's bullshit, right? And yet people kind of
I tell
subscribe to
people
this.
this like every
Yeah,
week.
yeah, yeah.
I almost don't know when the right time to worry about distribution is, because if you start thinking about distribution too young, then you're probably not going to have the time to develop the important skills to do research. Like I learned to do research not in AI, which I
Uh-huh.
think is like actually kind of nice. I did an electrical engineering undergrad and joined as like a MEMS system novel robotics person. I was like, huh, AI, like I should do AI. So I was like always at this intersection, but not in an AI group. And it's like my advisor is like, I mean, Chris Peaster, we're still friends. He's like, I'm an established scientist. I just want to build cool things, and we're just gonna like do science. And like, if you're in an environment where your advisor is from day one, it's like we have to care about distribution. I'm gonna do this. Like the pressures are harder. So like that's something
Yeah.
that is fundamental. Like shifting science this decade, we've seen the archive. I think is actually a mode where that happens rather than a cause. I think
Mhm.
internet, like the science will make distribution easy, and archive is just a place where things live. It's a server. So
Right.
I there's a lot of work to do on mentoring. There's like more work to do in mentoring when that is an added access.
That's true.
So, anything else you want to add on your book? The book is AI Snake Oil. You can read it. You should subscribe to the blog, as I said in the intro. It's like
Yeah, the
it's a
one thing.
long-term process, is what I've learned looking at what you've done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'll say about the book is that the kinds of AI that we're most skeptical about are not generative AI. It's, for the most part, traditional statistics regression models that have been recently rebranded as AI and are being used in criminal risk prediction, for instance, to make incredibly consequential decisions about people's lives. And you can't really predict the future. And so these systems are barely better than random. They have AUCs in the range of like zero point 0.6 to 0.7, and zero point 0.5 is random guessing. And we think that's very morally problematic.
How do we disambiguate them when people inevitably use language models in these systems?
I mean, they can use language models, but it just depends on what their prediction target is,
Yeah.
right? So trying to predict text sequences is very different from trying to predict genuinely what's going to happen in the future. That's not an AI versus human difference. It's not like AI is trying to catch up to human accuracy. The universe doesn't know what's going to happen in the future, so the irreducible error for those problems is very, very high.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think that's probably I'm not done with the book, but that's what the thing that I want to do better is trying to communicate what is going on in all of AI versus generative AI. I mean, my lane is somewhat narrow. Like I don't spend that much time. I'll go divvy out into like robotics and some automation things, which I think are not falling prey to those. So it's good to
Yeah.
have something to point at, which is like we have work that we need to continue on standard AI, but the way that you view generative AI is probably going to change a lot more quickly. And I find it more interesting because it seems like there's more opportunity, and I get a little discouraged with all the same predictive AI failures that have been going on for a decade.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm happy to wrap up here. It was great
Cool.
meeting
Yeah.
you. Great
Yeah,
talking.
you as well. It's been
It
really
sounds like
fun.
we agree on more things than I would have expected from.
Oh, it's
I
good to
mean,
know.
I didn't
Yeah.
really think through it. It's good fun, but the door will be open, and we'll see where this goes in the future.
Okay, wonderful.